Let's talk about Russia. I mean, it's not just big, it is mind-bogglingly huge. A country so immense, it's almost hard to wrap your head around. But how did one single nation end up dominating such a colossal piece of our planet? Today, we're going to unpack that epic, centuries-long story of ambition, conquest, and pure grit that forged the largest country on Earth.
I mean, just to put this into perspective, Russia covers over 6.6 million square miles. It is so vast that it literally stretches across 11 different time zones. You could take Canada, which is the world's second biggest country, and fit it inside Russia with plenty of room to spare. And for over 300 years, Russia has held on to that title. So, you have to ask, right? How did this happen? How did a nation that barely existed in its current form a few centuries ago expand to cover 1/8 of all the inhabited land on Earth? Well, let's dive in and unravel this absolutely remarkable story. All right, so to understand the explosion in size, we have to go back to the very beginning, to the geographical heartland of European Russia. This is where a bunch of scattered tribes and warring principalities would eventually get pulled together into one powerful, centralized state. So the story really kicks off back in the 9th century when Viking traders, they were known as the Rus, settled along the rivers and founded these city-states. But then in the 13th century, this massive threat came roaring in from the east, the Mongols, and for 200 years, they dominated the Rus lands. It wasn't until the 15th century that one of these little principalities, the Duchy of Moscow, got strong enough to finally challenge Mongol rule and start unifying the others. And all of this leads to a massive turning point in 1547. Ivan III's grandson, a guy named Ivan IV, decides to take on a brand new title. He's crowned the first Tsar of all Russia. And that title, that signals a whole new era of unified imperial ambition. You probably know him by his more famous nickname, Ivan the Terrible. Okay, so with a Tsar in charge and a unified state, Russia was basically primed to explode. And it happened in two completely different directions for two totally different reasons. A wild hunt for wealth in the east and the strategic obsession with getting a window on Europe in the west. Now, this is what I find so fascinating. You have two completely different stories of expansion happening at the same time. The push east was all about these rugged Cossack adventurers, basically freelancers hired to see what was out there in Siberia. Their goal? Fur, the incredible wealth from the fur trade. And they moved ridiculously fast across this vast, pretty empty territory, reaching the Pacific Ocean in less than 100 years. The drive west, on the other hand, was a totally different beast. That was a formal, state-led military campaign against the super powerful Swedish Empire, all to get one thing: a strategic warm water port on the Baltic Sea. And you'd think that eastward push would stop at the ocean's edge, right? Nope. In 1741, an expedition led by a Danish captain working for Russia, Vitus Bering, he crosses the strait that now has his name and formally claims Alaska for the empire. Just like that, Russia was a North American power. Meanwhile, back in the West, Tsar Peter the Great's big victory wasn't just about grabbing land. No, it was about fundamentally changing Russia's direction, turning it towards Europe. He built this magnificent new capital city right on the conquered land, a city he, modestly named after himself, St. Petersburg. This period really sets the stage for the 18th and 19th centuries, which is when the Russian Empire hit its absolute peak. I mean, this is when Russia becomes a true dominant force on the European continent. After Peter, you get Catherine the Great, and wow, she really doubles down, cementing Russia's superpower status. She pushes south, defeating the Ottoman Empire to get control of the Black Sea coast and annexing Crimea. And then to the west, she gets involved in carving up Poland, absorbing these huge territories that include a lot of modern-day Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. Well, naturally, when you keep pushing south into Central Asia like that, you're eventually going to bump into the other big colonial power of the time, Great Britain. This decades-long rivalry, this sort of chess match for influence over places like Afghanistan and Persia, became known as the Great Game. So picture this. Russia is at the absolute zenith of its power. It's flexing its muscles all across Europe and Asia. And then it makes a move that seems to defy all logic. A decision that just seems to contradict its relentless ambition. In 1867, it sells Alaska, all of it, to the United States. And for what? $7.2 million, which even back then was a shockingly small amount of money. It was basically a fire sale for a territory of that size. So why on earth would they sell?
Well, this right here gets to the heart of the great paradox of the Russian Empire. For all of its incredible size, it was actually pretty poor and technologically backward compared to its rivals in the West. And it was all ruled by this rigid, authoritarian Tsar system that was creating some serious political tensions just under the surface. And those weaknesses, those cracks just beneath the surface, they were about to lead to a complete and catastrophic collapse. The 20th century would see the empire fall, be reborn in a totally new ideological form, and then collapse all over again. The pace of change was just breathtaking. I mean, the strain of World War I was the final straw, and boom, in 1917, the Tsarist empire is gone. After a vicious civil war, the communists create the Soviet Union in 1922. And then, less than 70 years later, that state also disappears in 1991. Now, here's the crazy part. When the Bolsheviks finally won that brutal civil war, they managed to do something pretty remarkable. They held on to almost all of the old Russian Empire's territory. They used their new Red Army to reconquer regions that had tried to break away. So the country got a new name and a new ideology, but its enormous size, that pretty much stayed the same. After World War II, Soviet power expanded even more. It wasn't just about adding territory anymore. As you can see here, they directly annexed countries like the Baltic states right into the USSR. But they also created this huge sphere of influence by setting up communist puppet governments all across Eastern Europe, which became known as the Eastern Bloc. But, and this might sound familiar, just like the Tsarist Empire before it, the Soviet system just couldn't sustain itself. Decades of economic stagnation, a total failure to innovate, and growing pressure from all the different nationalities inside the Union eventually led to its collapse. The entire communist project started to crumble. The Soviet Union splintered into 15 independent countries, but its successor, the Russian Federation, was still vast and remains the largest country on Earth today. So this brings us to a really crucial question for our time. After all these centuries of expansion and contraction, what is the legacy of Russia's enormous borders? It's a legacy that continues to shape global politics, a story of a nation forever defined by its epic scale.